Right. I mean, the EU money club, as I'm calling it here, basically people who have the euro currency, they are pretty well regulated, though, aren't they, with regards to what their economic productivity is? Because the article here is arguing that Greece is the worst example in terms of its economic performance, but that the Greek government has to actually move very, very quickly. In fact, it even argues that they only qualified to join after they fiddled their figures, but that the government now has to act in some way so that investors will become more keen to lend it money. I mean, what would they have to do?
Well, there's a lot of issues with most of the southern European economies about inflexible economy in terms of especially the labour market. It's quite antiquated, very regulated, high charges for employers. Difficult to get rid of people, employees, and you have to pay a lot of contributions to actually recruit people and maintain people to the government. Also, the unions have a lot more power than in the more flexible northern European economies. So they haven't got the flexibility to adapt, yes. And they've got very high costs, and the per capita sort of the productivity of the average worker is much less because of that.
Right, and then the article is talking about the Greek government possibly having to implement some painful spending cuts, which would be a bit of a political no-no, and we know that unlike this country, there would probably be more likelihood of huge public demonstrations against that, which is tying their hands with regard to their electoral chances.
Well, what are the options? Doing the right thing, which would be to actually spend less to make sure that the overall government debt is sustainable in the long run is not something that's going to buy you votes in the short term.
Right.
And you know, as far as politicians doing what is right, or are they going to do what is popular and buys votes? If you cut back public spending, you are by definition reducing the amount of people that you're employing.
Right.
And that is
but also there's this article is talking about the need for a rescue operation, you know, and that there's an argument amongst many in the EU that they should do it themselves and exclude the IMF. What do you think about that before we move on to our second story?
Well, this is a growing problem. The IMF is now being talked about fairly regularly about coming in and rescuing countries now that are having problems. But where does the IMF get their money from? Right. They get it from the rich countries, mainly the Americans and the Europeans, who are skint at the moment. So now we're getting to a point where the IMF is talking about having to sell some of its gold. There's talk about having to sell 400 tons worth of gold to actually go and bail out countries. But what happens when we get to the point where the gold has all been sold? There's nothing left to back everything up.
Right. Well, let's move on with just a final quick quote from the article. It says that the IMF has a reputation for objectivity and is experienced at setting conditions. In other words, it's arguing for the IMF to be involved in some way, which brings us on to our second story, which is covered in the Wall Street Journal, and to an area of the world where the IMF is very heavily involved. And here is the article: Why Foreign Aid is Hurting Many African Countries. Money from rich nations fosters corruption, slow growth, and the cutting off of flow may be beneficial. Well, I have to come to you with that, Ronald. What are your first thoughts? Are you in agreement with that statement?
Well, there's all sorts of issues when it comes to Africa. I mean, it's considered a big jungle in terms of economical management.
But is foreign aid hurting Africa in any way?
There's no right answer to that question, because both arguments on either side, in my view, valid. One could argue that it is, and at the same time you can also argue that it isn't.
What do you think?
I think aid in general to Africa is a good thing. It is the conditions under which are imposed that are lessening the impact that it has on indigenous dwellers, those whom the aid is intended for.
Yes, yes.
So the argument is, it is not a question of the aid being a bad thing, but rather the dispensation of that aid.
So the targeting of where it goes to. I mean, coming to you, Marco, this article talks of endless examples of corrupt African leaders who, of course, have grabbed the aid and utilized it for themselves and their cohorts, usually an army, to keep them in power. I mean, how do you circumvent that dilemma? Because these are growing democracies that have their own contradictions, and aid in a lot of instances in the African continent post-independence has been an absolute disaster.
Well, yes. Is it propping up these corrupt leaders? In reality, probably yes. Is it aid free? Well, no. There's debt repayments that are involved with this, so that it's sort of giving with one hand, taking away with the other.
It is aid, is it not? I mean, there shouldn't be repayment matters to it because it is aid. I mean, it is given. It's a gift.
But that isn't how it's normally treated. A lot of the aid, especially through the World Bank, requires repayment, and this repayment, in many ways, if countries haven't done their maths properly and don't reinvest the money properly to create ongoing revenue from further taxation, from better economic activity, if the money is actually invested properly. If the money is wasted, you've still got the debt and the debt repayment, but you haven't invested it properly in creating more taxation revenue to be able to service it further on, so you're getting yourself into a bigger and bigger debt problem.
But it seems like the former colonial nations which are represented in the IMF, and same nations are also pouring aid in, but it's almost like they're balancing it out with the IMF demanding debt repayment and the aid being poured in to governments that are dubious in well over 50% of the cases, maybe even 90% of the cases. So where do the African people get any benefit from this? Because even the article itself, whilst talking a lot about the problem, doesn't actually go too much into a solution, other than citing the example of Botswana and South Africa, which without any aid have managed to become more self-sustaining and utilizing their own natural resources, because Africa has no shortage of natural resources but lacks a lot of production capacity to actually take advantage of that, Ronald.